Jessi Swan had always believed that family was everything. Growing up in suburban Minneapolis, she'd watched her mother Emily carefully set the good china every Thanksgiving, seen her father Robert carve the turkey with ceremonial precision, and felt the warmth of belonging that came with being part of something bigger than herself. But sometimes the people who are supposed to love you the most are the ones who cut the deepest. Sometimes the family dinner table becomes a battlefield. And sometimes walking away is the only way to find your worth. What Jessi didn't know that crisp November morning was that this Thanksgiving would change everything, not just for her, but for everyone who thought they knew exactly where she belonged in their carefully ordered world. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Jessi Swan's apartment in the Uptown neighborhood of Minneapolis was modest but warm, filled with plants she'd managed to keep alive and books stacked in neat piles on every surface. At 24, she had built a life that felt authentically hers, working as a graphic designer at a small creative agency downtown, spending weekends exploring farmers markets and art galleries, and slowly building a savings account that represented something her family had never quite understood: independence. The November morning light filtered through her kitchen window as she sat at her small dining table, laptop open, reviewing her bank account one more time. The number staring back at her was significant: $850 she'd earmarked specifically for this year's Thanksgiving celebration. It had taken her 3 months to save it, setting aside money from each paycheck with the kind of discipline that would have surprised her college friends who remembered her as spontaneous and carefree. But Jessi had changed since graduation. Moving out of her family's sprawling house in Edina had taught her the value of every dollar, every choice, every moment of autonomy she'd fought to create. The money wasn't just for turkey and sides. It was her contribution to the family gathering, her way of showing that despite living in her tiny one-bedroom apartment instead of the suburban fortress she'd grown up in, she could still pull her weight. Her phone buzzed with a text from her older sister Madison. "Mom wants to know if you're still planning to bring the turkey and all the sides. Uncle Jim and Aunt Carol are coming with the twins. Plus, Brandon's bringing his new girlfriend. It's going to be our biggest Thanksgiving yet." Jessi smiled, typing back quickly. "Absolutely. Already have everything planned. Can't wait to meet the new girlfriend." What she didn't mention was how carefully she'd orchestrated this contribution. She'd spent weeks researching the perfect, organic, free-range turkey from a local farm in Stillwater. She'd planned a menu of elevated sides: truffled mashed potatoes, green bean casserole made from scratch with crispy shallots, stuffing with wild mushrooms and sage from her own herb garden, and homemade cranberry sauce with orange zest and pecans. It wasn't just food, it was her way of proving something she couldn't quite put into words. The Swans family dynamics had always been complex, though Jessi was only beginning to understand just how complex. Her parents, Robert and Emily, had built their lives around the kind of suburban success that looked perfect from the outside: the 5-bedroom colonial in Edina, the matching BMWs in the driveway, the country club membership, and the annual family vacation to their lake house in Brainerd. Robert worked as a senior partner at a prestigious accounting firm, while Emily had dedicated herself to being the perfect corporate wife and mother, managing their social calendar with military precision. Madison, 2 years older than Jessi, had followed the prescribed path flawlessly. After graduating from the University of Minnesota with a business degree, she'd married her college boyfriend Derek, a software engineer at a major corporation. They lived in a beautiful new construction home in Plymouth, complete with a 3-car garage and plans for children that Emily discussed with the enthusiasm of someone planning a military campaign. Madison worked in marketing at a Fortune 500 company and seemed to glide through life hitting every expected milestone with enviable ease. Then there was Brandon, the baby of the family at 21. Still finishing his senior year at the University of Minnesota. As the only son and youngest child, he'd always occupied a special place in their parents' hearts. His struggles with college, changing majors twice, his grades fluctuating between excellent and barely passing, depending on his interest in the subject, were treated as charming quirks, rather than serious concerns. His new girlfriend, apparently, was the daughter of one of Robert's golf partners, which had elevated her to almost mythical status in Emily's eyes before anyone had even met her. And then there was Jessi,
the middle child who had somehow become the family's gentle disappointment. Not a failure exactly, but someone who had consistently chosen the harder path, the less predictable option, the route that made family gatherings slightly uncomfortable because it required explanations. When she chose graphic design over business, her father had sighed and asked if she was sure she could make a living with art. When she moved out after college, instead of living at home while saving money like Madison had, her mother worried aloud about safety and whether she was ready for that kind of responsibility. When she turned down a job at a large corporation in favor of the small creative agency, the family had exchanged those looks, the ones that said they loved her but didn't quite understand her choices. Over the past 2 years of living independently, these dynamics had become more pronounced rather than less. Family dinners involved subtle questions about her dating life, her career trajectory, her long-term plans. There was an underlying assumption that this phase of independence was temporary, that eventually she'd settle down with someone appropriate and move back to the suburbs where she belonged. But Jessi had discovered something in her small apartment surrounded by her own choices. She liked who she was becoming. She liked the challenge of managing her own budget, the satisfaction of cooking elaborate meals for one, the freedom to spend Saturday morning reading in coffee shops or exploring new neighborhoods. She liked her coworkers of the agency, creative, passionate people who understood why she'd spend 3 hours perfecting a font choice or get excited about a particularly clever logo concept. Most of all, she had started to understand that her family's love, while genuine, came with conditions she had never examined before. It was love that required her to fit into predetermined shapes, to want the things they thought she should want, to measure success by their metrics rather than her own.
The $850 represented something more than food for Thanksgiving dinner. It was her investment in belonging, her way of demonstrating that even though she'd chosen a different path, she was still committed to family, still capable of contributing in meaningful ways. She'd skipped dinners out, avoided shopping trips, declined invitations to concerts and shows, all so she could make this gesture. As she closed her laptop and began getting ready for work, Jessi felt the familiar mixture of anticipation and anxiety that accompanied family gatherings. She loved her family deeply, but she also felt the weight of their expectations, the subtle pressure to justify her choices, to prove that her different path wasn't a rejection of their values, but simply an expression of her own. Her phone rang as she was gathering her things for work. Emily's name appeared on the screen, and Jessi answered with genuine warmth. "Hi, Mom. Perfect timing. I was just thinking about Thursday." "Oh, wonderful, honey. I'm so excited. Aunt Carol called last night, and she's bringing her famous apple pie. And I told her about your truffle potatoes. She can't wait to try them. Uncle Jim's been talking about your cooking ever since Madison's birthday party last year." Jessi felt a flush of pride. Her cooking had become something of a family legend, though she suspected it was partly because it was unexpected. The artistic daughter who could also create magic in the kitchen. "I'm really looking forward to meeting Brandon's girlfriend, too," Jessi said, meaning it. "Oh, Stephanie is just lovely. Her father is one of Dad's golf partners, Tom Wellington. You might remember him. They have that beautiful house in Wayzata. She's getting her master's in education at St. Catherine, and she's just so poised and mature. I think she's exactly what Brandon needs." There it was. The subtle emphasis on poise and maturity, the mention of the house in Wayzata, the golf connection. These details weren't accidental. They were Emily's way of establishing credentials, of placing Stephanie in the family's social ecosystem. Jessi had learned to recognize these conversation patterns, the way her mother built cases for approval without stating them directly. "That sounds perfect for him," Jessi said, and meant it. She wanted Brandon to be happy, and if Stephanie could provide the kind of stability and direction he seemed to need, that was wonderful. "What time should I come over Thursday to start cooking?" Jessi asked. "Well, that's actually what I wanted to talk to you about. I know you've been planning this elaborate menu, but I'm wondering if maybe we should keep things a bit simpler this year. With so many people coming, I'm worried about the logistics of the kitchen, and you know how your father gets when there's too much chaos during football games." Jessi felt something shift in her chest, a small tremor of confusion.
But we talked about this weeks ago. I've already ordered the turkey, bought most of the ingredients. Oh, honey, I'm sure it would have been absolutely delicious. But you know how these big family gatherings can get, and with Stephanie there for the first time, I just want everything to go smoothly. Maybe next year we can plan better for one of your special menus. As Jessi hung up the phone a few minutes later, after agreeing to whatever worked best for the family, she stood in her kitchen feeling something she couldn't quite name. It wasn't just disappointment. It was deeper than that, more fundamental. It was the recognition that her contribution, her carefully planned gesture of love and investment, had been reduced to a logistics problem to be solved by someone else's credit card and a grocery store deli counter. She looked around her small apartment at the life she'd built with such intention and care, and wondered when exactly she'd become the family member whose efforts were appreciated in theory, but unnecessary in practice.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
The days leading up to Thanksgiving passed in a strange fog of disconnection. Jessi found herself going through the motions at work, designing holiday marketing materials for clients, while her own holiday plans crumbled in the background. She'd called the farm in Stillwater to cancel the turkey order, losing her $50 deposit in the process. The specialty ingredient she'd already purchased sat in her refrigerator like expensive reminders of plans that no longer mattered. Her coworker Marcus noticed her distraction during their Tuesday morning creative meeting. As their boss Patricia reviewed campaign concepts, Marcus slid a note across the conference table. "You look like someone stole your favorite pen. Everything okay?" Jessi managed a small smile and nodded, but the truth was more complicated. She felt untethered, as if the ground she'd been standing on had shifted just enough to throw off her balance. It wasn't just about the Thanksgiving menu. It was about what the casual dismissal represented, the pattern she was finally beginning to see clearly. After work, she stopped by her favorite coffee shop in the warehouse district, a place called Grounded that served locally roasted beans and had become her refuge for thinking through life's complications. The barista, a grad student named Alex, who always remembered her usual order, handed her a lavender latte and gestured toward her preferred corner table. "You seem off today," Alex observed, with the kind of casual concern that came from months of brief but genuine interactions. "Bad day at the office?" Jessi replied, settling into the worn leather chair that had become her unofficial therapy spot. "You know how it is." Alex nodded knowingly. "The holidays bring out everyone's true colors, don't they? Sometimes in ways we weren't ready to see." As Jessi sipped her latte and watched the early evening light fade over the city, she found herself thinking about patterns, not just in graphic design, where she could spot inconsistencies and flaws with professional precision, but in her own life. How many times had her contributions been quietly redirected, her ideas politely set aside, her efforts appreciated, but ultimately deemed unnecessary? She remembered her college graduation party, where she'd spent weeks planning a celebration that reflected who she was becoming. Local musicians, food from small restaurants she'd discovered, decorations she'd designed herself. Emily had smiled and praised her creativity, then hired a catering company the week before and transformed the whole event into something that looked suspiciously like Madison's graduation party 2 years earlier. There was her suggestion to spend last Christmas at a cabin in northern Minnesota instead of their usual formal dining room celebration. Robert had chuckled and said it sounded very Jessi, but they'd proceeded with tradition anyway, complete with Emily's precisely coordinated gift wrapping and the same menu they'd had for 15 years. Even smaller moments took on new significance in this light. Her recommendation for restaurants when the family went out to dinner, politely acknowledged and then ignored in favor of their usual spots. Her offers to help with family events, accepted enthusiastically, and then quietly managed around until her contributions were peripheral at best. The pattern was so consistent, so carefully maintained, that she'd never recognized it as a pattern at all. She'd interpreted it as family love, as being taken care of, as not having to worry about the big decisions. But sitting and grounded with the city buzzing around her, she began to understand it differently. It was a form of benevolent dismissal, a way of keeping her in the family while ensuring that her different perspective never actually influenced anything that mattered. Her phone buzzed with a text from Madison. "Can't wait for Thursday. Derek's bringing his famous green bean casserole, and Mom said Whole Foods has amazing stuffing this year. It's going to be so much easier than cooking everything from scratch." The enthusiasm in the message felt like salt in a wound Jessi was only beginning to acknowledge existed. Derek's famous green bean casserole was literally just the recipe from the French onions container, and he'd made it exactly once at last year's potluck at Madison's work. But somehow his minimal effort had earned the designation famous, while her months of planning had been relegated to too much chaos. That evening, Jessi did something she rarely allowed herself. She called her college roommate Sarah, now living in Portland and working as a social worker. Sarah had always been the friend who saw through facades and asked difficult questions, which is why she had been unconsciously avoiding her calls for the past few months. "Jessi! Perfect timing! I just got home from the most exhausting day and was about to pour a very large glass of wine. Please tell me you're calling with good news or at least interesting drama." Despite everything, Jessi laughed, Sarah had a gift for cutting straight through to what mattered. "I'm not sure if it counts as drama, but I think I might be having some kind of family crisis." "Oh, this sounds promising. Hold on, let me get comfortable and properly equipped with wine." "Okay, proceed." Jessi found herself explaining not just the Thanksgiving situation, but the broader pattern she was beginning to recognize. Sarah listened without interrupting, occasionally making small sounds of recognition that somehow felt more validating than any advice could have been. "Jessi," Sarah said, when she finished, "I have to ask you something, and I want you to really think about your answer. When was the last time your family asked for your opinion about something important and actually acted on it?"
The question hung in the air like a challenge. Jessi mentally scrolled through recent months, then years, looking for examples. She found herself reaching further and further back, past college, past high school, searching for moments when her perspective had genuinely influenced a family decision. "I can't think of any," she said finally, the admission feeling like a physical weight in her chest. "And when was the last time they asked about your life? Not your dating situation or your career prospects, but your actual life. What you're reading, what you're excited about, what you're struggling with, what you're learning." Another long pause, another uncomfortable recognition. "They don't really know who I am now," Jessi realized aloud. "They're still relating to some version of me from when I was 18 and living at home. They love that version of me, but they don't seem particularly interested in who I've become." "And how does that make you feel?" Sarah asked gently. "Invisible," Jessi said, surprised by the word that came out. "Like I'm there, but not really there. Like I'm playing a role in their story instead of being a real person with my own story." After they hung up, Jessi sat in her apartment feeling a clarity that was both liberating and terrifying. The Thanksgiving situation wasn't an isolated incident. It was a perfect microcosm of how her family functioned, how they maintained harmony by ensuring that everyone stayed in their assigned roles, how they showed love through a kind of protective dismissal that kept her safe but also kept her small. She thought about the $850 still sitting in her bank account, money that had represented her investment in belonging, but now felt like something else entirely. It felt like proof of her worth, evidence that she could contribute meaningfully if anyone actually wanted her to. Wednesday evening arrived with the kind of premature darkness that made Minneapolis Novembers feel like an endurance test. Jessi had spent the day at work trying to focus on a logo design for a local brewery, but her mind kept drifting to the next day's gathering. She'd agreed to bring dinner rolls, a contribution that felt safely minimal, unlikely to create chaos or complicate anyone's plans. But as she sat in her apartment that evening, surrounded by the life she'd built with such intention and care, she felt something shifting inside her. The conversation with Sarah had planted seeds of questions she couldn't ignore. Why was she so eager to prove her worth to people who seemed determined not to see it? Why was she grateful for dinner roll duty when she was capable of so much more? Why was she apologizing for taking up space in her own family?
She opened her laptop and looked at her bank account again. The $850 seemed to glow on the screen, a tangible reminder of her capacity to contribute, to plan, to execute something beautiful and meaningful. It represented months of discipline, weeks of anticipation, days of preparation. All of it dismissed in a 5-minute phone call about logistics and keeping things simple. For the first time since Emily's call, Jessi allowed herself to feel the full weight of her disappointment. Not just about the menu, but about the casual way her effort had been set aside. The assumption that she'd be grateful for the change, the complete lack of curiosity about what this contribution had meant to her. She thought about Marcus's note from the meeting. "You look like someone stole your favorite pen." It was such a specific metaphor, and suddenly she understood why it resonated. Someone had stolen something from her, but it wasn't a pen, it was her place at the table, her right to contribute meaningfully, her opportunity to show her family who she'd become and what she was capable of. As she got ready for bed, Jessi made a decision that surprised her with its clarity. She would go to Thanksgiving dinner, but she would go as herself. Not as the accommodating daughter who was grateful for whatever role she was assigned, but as the woman she'd become over the past 2 years of independence. She would bring the dinner rolls as requested, but she would also bring something else. The expectation that her presence mattered, that her voice deserved to be heard, that her contributions were valuable enough to be welcomed rather than managed around. She didn't know exactly what that would look like, but for the first time in weeks, she felt awake to her own life instead of sleepwalking through someone else's script. The $850 in her bank account wasn't wasted money. It was proof of her intention, her capability, her readiness to show up fully for the people she loved. Whether they were ready to receive that gift was about to become the real question.
Thanksgiving morning arrived with the kind of brilliant November sunshine that made Minneapolis look deceptively warm. Jessi woke earlier than usual, not from anxiety, but from a strange sense of anticipation that felt different from previous family gatherings. She'd slept better than she had in weeks, as if the clarity from her conversation with Sarah had settled something restless inside her. She made coffee in her small French press and stood by her kitchen window, watching her neighbors emerge from their apartments to start their own holiday traditions. Mrs. Chen from 3B was loading a covered dish into her car, probably heading to her daughter's house in St. Paul. The young couple from downstairs walked past carrying flowers and a bottle of wine, dressed up for what looked like a celebration with friends rather than family. There was something beautiful about watching people choose how to spend their holidays, Jessi realized. Choice, such a simple concept, but one that had somehow become foreign in the context of her own family traditions. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through social media, watching friends from college post pictures of their Thanksgiving preparations. Sarah had shared a photo from Portland of herself and 3 friends cooking together, all wearing ridiculous aprons and laughing at something off camera. Marcus had posted a picture of what appeared to be an elaborate Friendsgiving setup in someone's backyard, complete with string lights and a fire pit. These images struck her as fundamentally different from what she was preparing for. There was an ease to them, a sense of celebration that came from choosing to be together rather than obligation. Even the chaos looked joyful rather than stressful. Jessi set down her phone and made a decision that surprised her with its simplicity. She was going to approach today differently, not with rebellion or anger, but with presence, real, authentic presence. She was going to show up as herself and see what happened. The dinner rolls she had agreed to bring were already cooling on her counter. Simple, perfectly golden, made from a recipe she'd perfected over months of Sunday morning baking experiments. But looking at them now, she felt a familiar pang of limitation. These rolls represented safety, the kind of contribution that couldn't be criticized or improved upon by someone else. They were the culinary equivalent of staying in her lane. On impulse, she opened her refrigerator and surveyed the expensive ingredients still sitting there from her canceled menu plans.
The truffle oil she'd splurged on, the wild mushrooms, the fresh herbs she'd been nurturing in small pots on her windowsill. $850 worth of intention sitting there, like abandoned dreams. But they didn't have to be abandoned, she realized. They could be transformed. Jessi spent the next hour creating something entirely unplanned. A compound butter infused with roasted garlic, fresh thyme, and just a hint of the truffle oil. She shaped it into a log, wrapped it in parchment, and placed it in a small basket alongside the rolls. It wasn't the elaborate contribution she'd originally planned, but it was something more than what was expected. A small gesture of, "This is who I am," tucked into the safer offering of bread. As she got dressed, Jessi found herself thinking about armor. Not literal armor, but the emotional equivalent. For years, she'd armored herself for family gatherings with gratitude and accommodation, with the assumption that making things easier for everyone else was the same as making things better. Today, she was choosing different armor. The armor of authenticity, of showing up fully, even when that felt riskier than staying small. She chose clothes that felt like her, a deep burgundy sweater she'd bought at a local boutique, jeans that actually fit properly, boots that were both stylish and comfortable for the long day ahead. She looked in the mirror and saw someone who belonged in her own life, who had opinions and preferences, and the right to take up space. The drive to Edina took her through neighborhoods that marked a gradual transition from urban energy to suburban tranquility. As she turned onto familiar tree-lined streets, she felt the usual subtle pressure to shift into family mode, to become the version of herself that fit smoothly into their ecosystem. But today, she was resisting that transformation. Today, she was bringing all of herself to the table, literally and figuratively. The Swan house looked exactly as it always did for Thanksgiving, perfectly appointed, tastefully decorated, emanating the kind of effortless elegance that actually required enormous effort to maintain. Emily's seasonal decorations were magazine-worthy, all warm oranges and deep reds coordinated with natural elements that somehow never looked random, despite their studied casualness. Jessi parked behind Derek's pristine Audi and gathered her contributions, taking a deep breath that felt like preparation for a performance she'd never rehearsed. Madison opened the door before Jessi could knock and enveloped her in the kind of enthusiastic hug that felt genuine, despite everything. "Jessi, perfect timing. Mom's been watching for you. Everyone is already here except Uncle Jim and Aunt Carol, and they're running about 20 minutes late because of traffic. Come meet Stephanie." The house buzzed with the familiar energy of Swan family gatherings. Football on the television, Robert's voice carrying from the living room as he explained something to Brandon, the sound of Emily orchestrating multiple moving parts from the kitchen. But today, instead of feeling comforted by the familiarity, Jessi found herself observing it with new eyes. Stephanie was everything Emily's phone description had promised. Poised, beautifully dressed, engaging in conversation with the kind of effortless grace that came from a lifetime of similar gatherings. She was helping Emily arrange the whole food spread on serving platters, somehow managing to make store-bought food look homemade through strategic transfers and garnishes.
"Stephanie, this is my sister Jessi," Madison announced. "She's the artist in the family. She designed the logo for that new restaurant downtown, the one with the amazing cocktails." Stephanie's smile was warm and genuine as she wiped her hands on a dish towel before extending one. "It's so wonderful to meet you. Brandon talks about you all the time, and Madison showed me some of your design work. It's incredible. I love how creative your family is." There was nothing wrong with Stephanie, Jessi realized immediately. She was lovely, appropriate, exactly the kind of person who would fit seamlessly into family traditions and probably improve them through her natural sense of style and organization. The slight disappointment Jessi felt wasn't about Stephanie. It was about the recognition that here was someone who could contribute meaningfully without having her efforts redirected or simplified. "I brought rolls," Jessi said, holding up her basket, "and some herb butter to go with them. Oh, how thoughtful! Emily appeared at her shoulder, taking the basket with genuine appreciation. Stephanie was just telling me about the cooking classes she's been taking. She made the most beautiful cranberry sauce. It has pomegranate seeds and orange zest. Jessi felt a familiar tightening in her chest, but instead of pushing it away, she let herself examine it. It wasn't jealousy, exactly. It was recognition. Stephanie had been allowed to contribute something creative and personal, something that would be praised and remembered. Her cranberry sauce wouldn't be replaced by something from a store because it might create too much chaos. That sounds amazing, Jessi said, meaning it. I'd love to get the recipe. As the afternoon progressed, Jessi found herself in the curious position of being both participant and observer in her own family gathering. She watched Derek hold court in the living room, explaining his latest project at work to Robert and Brandon with the kind of confident authority that came naturally to him. She observed Madison effortlessly managing conversations between different family members, creating connections and smoothing over the small awkwardnesses that arose when different generations mixed. But she also noticed things she'd never paid attention to before, how her contributions to conversations were acknowledged but not built upon, how discussions about important topics, career moves, family decisions, future plans, seemed to flow around her rather than including her perspective, how her role in the family had become so fixed that breaking out of it felt almost impossible without creating friction. During dinner preparation, as Emily directed traffic in the kitchen with military precision, Jessi was assigned to setting the table, a task that felt deliberately safe and contained. She arranged the good china and crystal with practiced efficiency, while around her, Stephanie helped coordinate the final heating and plating of dishes, Madison managed beverage service, and even Derek contributed by carving the ham Emily had added to complement the turkey. Standing in the dining room, arranging place settings for a meal she'd originally planned to create herself, Jessi felt something crystallize inside her. This was her choice point, not just for today, but for how she wanted to exist within her family going forward. She could continue to accept whatever role was assigned to her, grateful for inclusion, even when that inclusion felt more theoretical than real. Or she could start insisting on her own value, her own voice, her own right to contribute meaningfully. The $850 in her bank account suddenly felt less like wasted money and more like a down payment on her own self-respect. It represented her capacity to show up fully, to invest in relationships with intention and generosity. The fact that her family hadn't been ready to receive that gift didn't diminish its value. It revealed something about their expectations and limitations, not hers. As she folded the linen napkins with careful precision, Jessi made a quiet promise to herself. Whatever happened at this dinner, she would speak from her authentic voice rather than the accommodating version she'd perfected over years of trying to make things easier for everyone else. She would trust that her perspective had value, even if others couldn't see it yet. The call to action wasn't dramatic or rebellious. It was simply the decision to show up as herself and see what her family did with that gift. Whether they could receive her authenticity would tell her everything she needed to know about her place at this table and what changes needed to happen going forward.
The Swan family dining room had been transformed into what could only be described as a Norman Rockwell painting come to life. Emily's perfectly coordinated autumn tablescape stretched across the mahogany table, complete with brass candlesticks, seasonal gourds, and cloth napkins folded into intricate shapes that somehow looked effortless despite the obvious time investment. The Whole Foods feast had been artfully arranged to disguise its commercial origins, and everything gleamed under the warm light of the chandelier Robert had installed the previous spring. Jessi took her assigned seat, the same chair she'd occupied at family dinners for as long as she could remember, positioned between Brandon and Uncle Jim when he arrived. The seating arrangement was another Swan family tradition that had calcified over time, placing everyone in their designated spots like pieces on a chessboard that never changed strategy. As Uncle Jim and Aunt Carol finally arrived with apologies about construction traffic on Highway 100, the dinner officially began with Robert's traditional blessing. He stood at the head of the table, surveying his family with the satisfied expression of a man whose life had unfolded according to plan, and offered thanks for health, prosperity, and the continuation of family traditions that bound them all together. The irony wasn't lost on Jessi that gratitude for tradition was being offered over a meal that had replaced her months of planning with grocery store convenience, but she bowed her head and listened, noting how the blessing emphasized continuity and stability, values that suddenly seemed less comforting and more confining than they had in previous years. And now, Robert concluded, let's enjoy this feast that the women of our family have so beautifully prepared. It was such a small thing, really, the casual erasure of her original contribution, the assumption that the women had collaborated on something that Stephanie and Emily had actually orchestrated while Jessi arranged place settings. But that small dismissal felt like a preview of the evening ahead. Brandon immediately launched into stories about his senior year, regaling everyone with tales of fraternity adventures and his uncertain post-graduation plans. His narrative style was charming but meandering, full of tangents about friends no one else knew, and inside jokes that required lengthy explanations. The family listened with the indulgent attention reserved for youngest children, asking follow-up questions and expressing appropriate concern about his job search timeline. "I'm thinking maybe I'll take a year off after graduation," Brandon announced, helping himself to a generous portion of stuffing. Jake's older brother did that, backpacked for Europe for 6 months, then came back and got an amazing job at a startup. Sometimes you need life experience before you can figure out what you really want to do, you know? Robert nodded thoughtfully. That's actually not a bad strategy in today's market. Taking time to gain perspective before making major career decisions shows maturity. Jessi nearly choked on her wine. 2 years earlier, when she'd mentioned considering freelance design work before committing to a corporate job, Robert had expressed serious concerns about financial stability and building a proper resume. But Brandon's hypothetical gap year was being praised as mature, strategic thinking. "Europe sounds amazing," Stephanie chimed in. "I did a semester abroad in Florence during undergrad. It completely changed my perspective on art and culture. There's something about experiencing different ways of life that really expands your worldview." The conversation naturally flowed toward travel experiences, with Madison sharing memories of her honeymoon in Greece and Derek describing a business trip to Germany that had turned into a cultural exploration. Even Uncle Jim contributed stories about a fishing expedition to Alaska that had taught him important lessons about patience and resilience. Jessi found herself listening to this exchange with growing awareness of its patterns. Everyone's travel experiences were being treated as meaningful and formative, but she remembered mentioning her weekend trips to explore Minnesota's art communities, visits to Grand Marais galleries, the sculpture gardens in Franconia, the emerging arts district in Duluth, and how those had been dismissed as nice little adventures rather than genuine cultural exploration. "What about you, Jessi?" Stephanie asked, with genuine interest. "Do you have any travel plans coming up? I imagine your design work would be so inspired by seeing different architectural styles and artistic traditions." It was a thoughtful question, the kind that acknowledged Jessi's professional interests and suggested that travel for an artist might serve different purposes than travel for leisure. For a moment, Jessi felt genuinely seen by someone who barely knew her. "I've actually been saving up for a trip to Portland, actually. Sarah, my college roommate, lives there now, and the design scene is incredible. They have this amazing intersection of traditional craftsmanship and cutting-edge digital work that I'd love to study firsthand." "Portland?" Emily laughed in a way that wasn't quite dismissive, but wasn't entirely supportive either. "Well, that's very practical. I suppose it would be related to work." The subtle emphasis on practical carried weight that Jessi was finally learning to decode. Emily's comment positioned Jessi's trip as utilitarian rather than enriching, work-related rather than personally meaningful. Brandon's hypothetical European adventure was gaining perspective, but Jessi's concrete plans to study her chosen field were merely practical. "It's actually both," Jessi said, feeling her resolve to speak authentically kick in. "The professional development aspect is important, but I'm also excited about the cultural elements. Portland has an incredible food scene, amazing coffee culture, and a really vibrant arts community that's doing innovative work with sustainability and social justice."
Social justice? Derek raised an eyebrow with a kind of amused skepticism that made Jessi's stomach tighten. In graphic design?
Absolutely, Jessi replied, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. Design shapes how people interact with information, how they understand complex issues, how they feel about organizations and causes. The work being done in Portland around environmental messaging and community organizing is really sophisticated, using visual storytelling to make complicated topics accessible and compelling. She could feel the table's energy shift slightly, the way conversations do when someone introduces a topic that doesn't quite fit the established rhythm. Madison jumped in with a quick segue about the beautiful environmental campaigns she'd seen in her marketing work, but the moment had created a small crack in the evening's smooth facade. As dinner progressed, Jessi found herself navigating a series of these small obstacles, moments where her authentic voice met the family's established patterns and created subtle friction. When Uncle Jim mentioned concerns about young people today, not understanding the value of hard work, Jessi offered a different perspective about how her generation was redefining success to include work-life balance and social impact. When the conversation turned to housing costs and Derek complained about unrealistic expectations among young buyers, Jessi shared insights about the creative ways people her age were approaching urban living, from co-housing projects to intentional communities. Each time she spoke from her genuine perspective, rather than offering polite agreement, the response was the same, a brief moment of surprise, followed by quick redirection to safer topics. It was like trying to introduce new ingredients to a recipe that had been perfected years ago. Any addition, no matter how thoughtful, was treated as an unwelcome complication. The most telling moment came when Aunt Carol asked about her dating life, a question that had become standard at family gatherings. "Anyone special in your life, Jessi? You're at such a perfect age to meet someone serious." In the past, Jessi had deflected these questions with vague responses about being busy with work and enjoying her independence. Tonight, she decided to answer honestly. "I'm actually really enjoying this phase of getting to know myself better. Living alone has taught me so much about what I value and what kind of partnership I'd actually want. I think taking time to develop as an individual makes you a better partner when the right person comes along." "Oh, that's a lovely way to think about it," Aunt Carol replied, with the kind of tone people use when they're being polite about something they don't quite understand. "But sometimes the right person comes along when you least expect it. You don't want to be so focused on yourself that you miss opportunities." The subtle correction was expertly delivered, acknowledging Jessi's perspective while simultaneously suggesting it was incomplete or potentially misguided. Emily nodded in agreement, adding her own concerns about waiting too long and missing the best options, as if Jessi's romantic life were a limited-time sale rather than a personal journey. As the main course wound down and Emily began orchestrating the transition to dessert, Jessi felt the familiar weight of being managed rather than included. Her attempts to contribute authentically to conversations had been met with polite tolerance followed by swift redirection. Her perspectives had been acknowledged but not engaged with, accepted but not built upon. The obstacles weren't dramatic or intentionally cruel. They were the subtle resistance of a system that had learned to function smoothly by keeping everyone in their designated roles. Jessi was discovering that speaking authentically within her family wasn't just about finding her voice. It was about challenging a carefully maintained equilibrium that had never been designed to accommodate her full presence. The $850 sitting in her bank account suddenly felt less like wasted opportunity and more like evidence of her readiness to invest in relationships that could receive her genuine contributions. The question becoming clearer with each passing course was whether this family dinner table was capable of being that kind of relationship.
The transition to dessert brought with it a shift in the evening's energy. Emily had orchestrated the moment with her usual precision, clearing the main course dishes while simultaneously unveiling an impressive array of pies and coffee service that transformed the dining room into something resembling a high-end bakery display. Aunt Carol's famous apple pie sat alongside offerings from a local pastry shop that Emily had discovered the week before, each dessert strategically positioned to create visual harmony across the table. As coffee was poured and dessert plates distributed, the conversation naturally fragmented into smaller groups. Robert and Derek gravitated toward discussion of football scores and playoff predictions, their voices carrying the comfortable authority of men accustomed to having their sports opinions treated as expert analysis. Madison and Stephanie found themselves deep in conversation about wedding planning. Apparently, Derek's cousin was getting married in the spring, and Stephanie had opinions about venues and catering that Madison found fascinating. Jessi found herself in the curious position of being between conversations rather than part of them, a social geography that had become increasingly familiar over the past few hours. She could join the football discussion, but her genuine lack of interest would quickly become apparent. She could contribute to wedding planning talk, but as the unmarried sister, her input would likely be received as theoretical rather than practical. Instead, she found herself genuinely listening to Brandon, who had moved on from his European travel fantasies to describing a photography project he'd been working on for his senior seminar. It was the first time all evening that he'd mentioned something creative and personally meaningful, and Jessi felt a spark of real connection as he pulled out his phone to show her some of the images. "These are incredible, Brandon," she said, scrolling through photos that captured campus life with an unexpected depth and artistry. "I had no idea you were doing photography work. This composition here, the way you've used the morning light coming through the library windows, it's really sophisticated." Brandon's face lit up with genuine pleasure at her recognition. "Really? I've been kind of nervous about presenting it. Professor Martinez says it shows promise, but I wasn't sure if that was just, professor politeness." "No, this is legitimate artistic work," Jessi insisted, studying a particularly striking image of students silhouetted against snow-covered campus buildings. "Have you thought about pursuing photography after graduation? There are amazing programs for photojournalism, and your eye for capturing authentic moments is really developed." It was Emily who interrupted their conversation, leaning over to glance at Brandon's phone with motherly interest. "Oh, those are lovely, sweetheart. Very artistic. Though I do hope you're not getting too distracted from your business courses. Photography is such a competitive field, probably better as a hobby than a career path." The dismissal was gentle but definitive, delivered with the kind of loving concern that made disagreement seem ungrateful. Watched Brandon's expression shift subtly, the excitement in his eyes dimming as he tucked his phone away and nodded in agreement with his mother's practical wisdom. "Brandon," Jessi said, her voice carrying a conviction that surprised even her, "don't let anyone convince you that creating meaningful work is impractical. The world needs people who can see beauty and capture truth. If this photography speaks to something real in you, that matters more than playing it safe." The words hung in the air longer than she had intended, carrying weight that extended beyond encouragement for Brandon's artistic pursuits. She could feel the table's attention shifting toward their corner of the conversation, drawn by something in her tone that suggested she wasn't just talking about photography anymore. Emily's laugh was light, but carried a note of correction. "Well, of course creativity is wonderful, but we also have to be realistic about supporting ourselves. Brandon has such a bright future in business, it would be a shame to get sidetracked by something so uncertain." "Why does it have to be either or?" Jessi asked, genuinely curious about the assumption underlying Emily's response. "Why can't someone build a career around what they're passionate about and good at? Brandon clearly has talent. Shouldn't that be worth investing in and developing?" "Because art doesn't pay the bills," Derek interjected from across the table, his tone carrying the patient condescension of someone explaining obvious facts to someone who clearly didn't understand how the world worked. "It's fine as a hobby, but you need something stable as your foundation." Jessi felt something crystallize inside her, a moment of recognition that this conversation had moved far beyond Brandon's photography into territory that felt personal and urgent. But what if stability isn't the most important thing? What if doing work that matters to you, that uses your actual talents and interests, is worth some uncertainty? "That's very idealistic," Robert said, his voice carrying the gentle authority of paternal wisdom. "But real life requires making practical choices. Look at Madison. She found work that's both satisfying and financially responsible. That's the smart approach." The comparison stung more than Jessi had expected, not because Madison had made wrong choices, but because it revealed how her own path was being evaluated. Madison's marketing career was satisfying and financially responsible, while Jessi's design work was apparently neither sufficiently stable nor properly practical. "What if my work is both satisfying and financially responsible?" Jessi asked, her voice steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. "I support myself doing work I love, work that has meaning and impact. Isn't that exactly what you're saying Madison accomplished?" The silence that followed was brief, but loaded with the kind of tension that comes when someone points out an inconsistency that everyone has been politely ignoring. Emily was the first to respond, her voice warm but firm. "Of course your work is lovely, sweetheart. We're so proud of your artistic talents. But design is different from photography. It's more commercial, more stable. You've made very responsible choices." The praise felt like being patted on the head, a reward for staying within acceptable boundaries rather than recognition of genuine achievement. Jessi realized that her family's support for her career came with invisible conditions. It was acceptable because it wasn't too artistic, too risky, too far outside their understanding of appropriate professional paths. "But what if I wanted to take more risks?" she asked, the question emerging from someplace deeper than conscious planning. "What if I wanted to do more experimental work, or start my own studio, or focus on projects that might not be commercially safe, but could be personally meaningful?" The question seemed to catch everyone off guard, including Jessi herself. She hadn't been planning to announce any career changes, but something about the conversation had pulled this possibility to the surface. The recognition that she had been unconsciously limiting herself to choices her family could understand and approve of. Madison leaned forward with sisterly concern. "Is everything okay at your job? Are you having problems at the agency?" "No, nothing like that," Jessi said quickly, then paused to consider what she actually meant. "I love my work there, but I've been thinking about what comes next, about whether I want to keep building someone else's vision or start developing my own." "That sounds wonderful in theory," Emily said carefully, "but starting your own business is so risky, especially in a creative field. Wouldn't it be smarter to build more experience and save more money first?" There it was again, the assumption that her impulses needed to be managed. Her timing needed to be corrected. Her dreams needed to be made more practical before they could be supported. Jessi found herself thinking about the $850 in her bank account, money she'd saved through exactly the kind of discipline and planning her family claimed to value. She had been building experience, saving money, making responsible choices. But somehow, when she hinted at using those resources to take creative risks, the goalposts moved. "How much more experience? How much more money?" she asked, genuinely curious about what benchmarks would need to be met before her family considered her ready for independence. The question seemed to stump them. Robert started to answer, then stopped. Emily looked thoughtful but uncertain. The truth was, there probably weren't specific benchmarks. There was just a general sense that whatever she was currently doing wasn't quite enough, wasn't quite ready, wasn't quite the right time. As the evening progressed toward its natural conclusion, Jessi found herself fully committed to a transformation she hadn't entirely planned. The conversation about Brandon's photography had become a conversation about her own choices, her own dreams, her own right to take up space in her own life. She wasn't just testing the waters of authenticity anymore, she was diving in completely, ready to discover what her family would do with the full truth of who she was becoming. The stakes had shifted from wanting to be seen to insisting on being seen, from hoping for acceptance to demanding the right to exist as herself. Whatever happened next, Jessi knew she couldn't go back to the smaller version of herself that fit more comfortably into their expectations. The deepening journey had become irreversible, and that felt both terrifying and absolutely necessary.
The evening had taken on the languid quality that comes with extended family gatherings.
Coffee cups refilled multiple times, dessert plates pushed aside but not cleared, conversations meandering through topics with the unhurried pace of people who know they have nowhere else to be. Uncle Jim had settled into his traditional post-dinner position in Robert's leather recliner, remote control in hand, surfing between football games with the casual authority of someone comfortable in another man's home. Jessi felt herself caught between two competing impulses. Part of her wanted to retreat into the familiar safety of family dinner small talk, to let the earlier tensions dissolve into the comfortable routine of helping with dishes and accepting compliments on her dinner rolls. But a stronger part of her, the part that had been awakened by her conversations with Sarah and her growing recognition of family patterns, refused to step backward from the authenticity she'd been claiming all evening. The moment that changed everything came when Madison, with the best of intentions, tried to bridge what she clearly sensed as growing distance between Jessi and the rest of the family. "You know, Jessi," Madison said, settling back into her chair with a warm smile, "I've been thinking about what you said earlier about taking more creative risks. Derek and I were talking, and we think you should definitely pursue some freelance projects on the side. Build up a portfolio and some extra income before making any major changes." It was meant to be supportive, Jessi realized. Madison was trying to find a compromise that honored Jessi's creative ambitions while staying within the family's comfort zone of careful, gradual progress. Derek nodded in agreement, adding his own perspective about the importance of keeping your day job while you test the waters. "That's actually really smart advice," Emily chimed in, her relief at finding a middle ground evident in her voice. "You could do little projects on weekends and evenings, see how it goes. No need to make any dramatic changes right away." The word dramatic hit Jessi like a physical blow. Without meaning to, her family had just labeled her desire for creative independence as drama rather than growth, as something that needed to be contained and managed, rather than supported and celebrated. The $850 in her bank account, carefully saved through months of discipline, was apparently not evidence of her readiness to invest in herself, but proof that she needed to be talked out of impulsive decisions. "What if I don't want to wait?" Jessi asked, her voice carrying a steadiness that surprised everyone, including herself. "What if I've already done the careful planning, saved the money, and I'm ready to take the leap now?" The silence that followed was different from the earlier conversational pauses. This one carried weight, the kind of tension that comes when someone has said something that can't be unsaid or easily redirected. Robert cleared his throat with the deliberate authority of someone stepping in to manage a situation that was getting out of hand. "Jessi, honey, we can all hear how passionate you are about this, and that's wonderful. But passion without practical planning is just wishful thinking. You're 24 years old. You have plenty of time to build up to bigger risks when you're more established." "More established how?" Jessi asked, genuinely wanting to understand the criteria by which her readiness was being measured. "I have a college degree, 2 years of professional experience, a strong portfolio, money saved specifically for this purpose, and a clear vision of what I want to create. What exactly am I missing?" "Life experience," Derek said with the confident certainty of someone 7 years older who had followed a traditional path. "The business world is complicated. You need to understand how things really work before you try to go out on your own." "But I do understand how things work," Jessi replied, feeling frustration bubble up despite her efforts to stay calm. "I work with clients every day. I manage budgets and timelines and creative briefs. I've been supporting myself independently for 2 years. I'm not some naive kid with unrealistic dreams. I'm an adult with concrete skills and specific goals." "Of course you are, sweetheart," Emily said, her voice carrying the kind of soothing tone typically reserved for overwrought children. "We're not questioning your abilities. We just want to make sure you're thinking this through carefully." "But I have thought it through," Jessi said, her voice rising slightly despite her attempts to stay measured. "I've been thinking about it for months. I've researched the market, identified potential clients, calculated what I'd need to cover my expenses. This isn't a whim, it's a plan."
Plans change when they meet reality, Uncle Jim said from his position in the recliner, not bothering to look away from the television. Better to test the waters first than jump in and find out you can't swim.
The casual dismissal from someone who barely knew the details of her life or career felt like a slap. Jessi turned to look at him directly, her patience finally beginning to fray at the edges. "What if I already know I can swim?" she asked. "What if I've been swimming successfully for 2 years and now I'm ready for deeper water?" "Swimming in a pool is different from swimming in the ocean," Uncle Jim replied, with the kind of metaphorical wisdom that sounded profound but actually said nothing specific about her situation. Aunt Carol nodded in agreement. "Your uncle's right, honey. It's always better to be safe than sorry. Maybe start with some small freelance projects and see how it goes." Jessi felt something break inside her, not dramatically, but quietly, like a thread that had been stretched too thin for too long. Every suggestion, every piece of advice, every loving redirection was built on the same fundamental assumption that she couldn't be trusted to make good decisions about her own life, that her assessment of her own readiness was inherently flawed, that other people who didn't know the details of her work, her finances, or her carefully considered plans, were better qualified to determine her timeline than she was. "Why?" she asked, the single word carrying more weight than she'd intended. "Why is it always, wait a little longer, be more careful, test the waters first? Why can't anyone in this family imagine that I might actually know what I'm doing?" The question hung in the air like an accusation, because that's essentially what it was. Jessi had finally named the pattern that had been governing her relationships with her family for years. The assumption that her judgment was suspect, her timing was wrong, her dreams needed to be scaled down to acceptable proportions. "Now you're being defensive," Madison said, her voice carrying a note of frustrated concern. "We're trying to help you avoid making a mistake that could hurt your future." "What mistake?" demanded Jessi. "Starting a business, doing work I love and I'm good at, using money I've saved responsibly to invest in my own career, following the same entrepreneurial spirit that you all praise when men do it?" "That's not fair," Derek said, his tone sharpening. "This isn't about gender. It's about being realistic about market conditions and your level of experience." "Really?" Jessi said, feeling years of accumulated frustration finally finding its voice. Because when Brandon talks about taking a gap year to find himself in Europe, everyone thinks it shows maturity and vision. When I talk about using actual savings and concrete skills to build something meaningful, everyone thinks I need to slow down and be more careful. "That's completely different," Emily protested. "Brandon's still in college. He has time to explore before making permanent decisions." "And I don't have time to explore? At 24, I'm too old for exploration but too young for independence? What exactly is the window where my decisions become valid?" The conversation had spiraled beyond anyone's ability to control it, and Jessi could see the family exchange glances that conveyed shared concern about her attitude and unreasonable responses to their well-meaning advice. She was being cast as the problem, the difficult family member who was making Thanksgiving dinner uncomfortable by refusing to accept guidance gracefully. Robert stood up with the decisive movement of someone taking charge of a situation that had gotten out of hand. "I think we all need to take a step back here. Jessi, you're clearly feeling defensive about some decisions you're considering, but attacking your family for caring about your welfare isn't going to help anyone." The words hit Jessi like a physical blow. In one sentence, Robert had reframed her frustration with being consistently dismissed as an attack on people who cared about her. Her desire for autonomy had been redefined as defensiveness. Her attempts to explain her readiness had been characterized as unreasonable resistance to loving guidance. She looked around the table at faces that reflected varying degrees of concern, disappointment, and confusion. Brandon looked uncomfortable, caught between loyalty to his family and sympathy for his sister. Stephanie appeared genuinely puzzled by the entire exchange. Madison and Derek shared expressions of frustrated concern, while Emily looked genuinely hurt by what she clearly perceived as Jessi's rejection of their support. For the first time all evening, Jessi felt truly alone.
not just misunderstood, but fundamentally isolated from people who claimed to love her but couldn't seem to hear what she was actually saying. The $850 in her bank account suddenly felt less like evidence of her capability and more like proof of a fundamental mismatch between who she was and who her family needed her to be.
The silence that followed Robert's authoritative shutdown stretched longer than anyone felt comfortable with. Jessi could hear the distant sound of football announcers from the television, the subtle clink of ice settling in water glasses, the almost imperceptible hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. These ordinary household sounds seemed amplified in the tension, creating a soundtrack for a moment that felt both inevitable and completely unexpected. Jessi looked around the table one more time, taking in the faces of people who had shaped her entire understanding of family, love, and belonging. Emily's expression carried the wounded confusion of someone who genuinely couldn't understand why her daughter was rejecting what felt like reasonable guidance. Madison's face showed the strained concern of a sister caught between loyalty and bewilderment. Derek appeared ready to offer more practical advice if anyone would just listen to reason. Brandon looked like he wanted to disappear entirely, probably regretting that his photography had somehow sparked this entire confrontation. Even Stephanie, who barely knew any of them, seemed uncomfortable with the family dynamics she'd unwittingly stepped into. Uncle Jim and Aunt Carol maintained the careful neutrality of relatives who wanted to finish their dessert and coffee without getting pulled into what was clearly a deeper family issue than anyone had anticipated. But it was Robert's expression that finally crystallized something essential for Jessi. He looked genuinely perplexed by her reaction, authentically confused about why his reasonable, fatherly guidance had been met with such resistance. There was no malice in his face, no intentional cruelty, just the absolute certainty of someone who had never questioned his right to determine what was best for the people he loved. And that's when Jessi understood something that changed everything. This wasn't about her family being intentionally dismissive or cruel. This wasn't about them not loving her or wanting her to fail. This was about a fundamental mismatch between who they needed her to be and who she actually was. They loved a version of her that fit comfortably into their understanding of family, success, and appropriate life choices. But that version was becoming smaller and smaller compared to the person she was actually becoming. "You know what?" Jessi said, her voice carrying a strange calm that surprised everyone, including herself. "You're all absolutely right." The admission seemed to catch the entire table off guard. Emily's expression shifted from hurt to relief, while Madison leaned forward with renewed hope that they could find their way back to harmony. "I am being defensive," Jessi continued, standing up from her chair with deliberate composure. "I am questioning guidance from people who love me. I am making Thanksgiving dinner uncomfortable by insisting on talking about things that don't fit the conversation you all want to have." She paused, looking around the table one more time, memorizing faces and expressions, and the feeling of being in this dining room where she'd eaten countless meals, celebrated countless holidays, participated in countless conversations that followed these exact same patterns. "But here's what I've realized," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I'm not defensive because I'm wrong about my capabilities or my readiness or my plans. I'm defensive because I've been trying to convince people who don't want to be convinced. I've been asking for permission from people who will never believe I'm ready to stop asking for permission." Emily started to protest, but Jessi held up a gentle hand. "Mom, I know you love me. I know you want me to be safe and successful and happy, but your definition of those things requires me to be smaller than I actually am. It requires me to doubt myself even when I have good reasons for confidence. It requires me to be grateful for limitations that I don't actually need." She walked to the beautiful mahogany sideboard where Emily displayed her good china, pulling out her purse with the same careful movements she'd set the table hours earlier. "I saved $850 specifically to contribute to this Thanksgiving dinner. 3 months of careful budgeting,
weeks of planning, because I wanted to show you all that I could contribute something meaningful to our family traditions.
She placed 9 $50 bills on the polished wood surface, arranging them in a neat stack, like an offering on an altar. When that contribution was canceled, politely with good intentions for perfectly reasonable logistical reasons, I told myself it was fine, that what mattered was family togetherness, not who cooked what. But it wasn't fine, because it was just the latest example of a pattern I'm finally seeing clearly. The money sat on the sideboard, like evidence in a case no one had realized was being tried. This money represents my ability to plan, save, invest, and follow through on commitments. It represents months of discipline and careful decision-making. It represents exactly the kind of responsibility and foresight you all say I need to develop before I can be trusted with bigger decisions. But when I try to use these qualities to make choices about my own life, suddenly they're not enough. Suddenly I need more experience, more time, more caution. She looked directly at Robert, then Emily, then each family member in turn. I'm not angry with any of you. I understand that you're trying to protect me from risks you think I'm not ready to handle. But I can't keep living my life at the pace of your comfort level. I can't keep being grateful for being managed instead of supported. Madison stood up, her voice carrying genuine distress. Jessi, please don't leave like this. We can talk through these things. We can find a way. To what? Jessi asked gently. To convince me to want smaller things? To be patient for a few more years while I prove I'm ready for independence I've already been living successfully? To be grateful that people who don't know the details of my work or my finances or my carefully made plans are willing to advise me about my timing? She slung her purse over her shoulder and looked one last time at the Thanksgiving table that had been set with such care and intention. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was leaving behind a meal she would have been honored to prepare, walking away from people she genuinely loved, because sometimes love isn't enough if it comes with conditions that require you to be less than you are. The money is for next year's Thanksgiving, she said, nodding toward the bills on the sideboard. If you want me here, if you want my contribution to actually be welcomed instead of managed, then maybe we can start planning a meal together, really together, with my ideas included from the beginning, my capabilities trusted, my judgment respected. She paused at the doorway, turning back to face the table full of people who looked stunned by the sudden transformation of their traditional family gathering. I love you all. I want to be part of this family, but I won't keep shrinking myself to fit into the space you've decided is appropriate for me. When you're ready to know who I actually am, instead of who you think I should be, call me. Until then, I'll be building the life I've been planning while you've been advising me to wait. The walk to her car felt surreal, as if she were moving through someone else's life rather than her own. The November air was sharp and clean after the warm intensity of the dining room, and she took deep breaths as she unlocked her car door. Her hands were surprisingly steady as she started the engine and backed out of the driveway, past Derek's Audi and Madison's SUV, past the perfectly maintained landscaping that had always made the Swan house look like something from a magazine. As she drove through the familiar streets of Edina, heading back toward the city and her small apartment that suddenly felt like the most honest place in the world, Jessi realized something that felt like freedom. She had stopped asking for permission she didn't need from people who weren't qualified to give it. She had stopped being grateful for limitations disguised as love. She had claimed her right to be herself, fully and without apology, even when that meant walking away from people who couldn't receive that gift.
The $850 on Emily's sideboard wasn't wasted money. It was an investment in her own self-respect, proof that she was ready to put her money where her values were, literally and figuratively. Whether her family would ever be ready to accept her invitation to know her as she actually was remains to be seen. But for the first time in years, that was their choice to make, not hers to manage. The road ahead felt wide open with possibility.
Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.